Yeah, hey, good morning, Patrick, and thanks. I always prefer dialogue, but they said that the scope and scale of what we have today meant that I just have to talk. So I appreciate everyone patiently listening in. Let me get my screen open to share, um, and we can go from there. One moment. So I always really like, yeah. So if everyone can see that, that's great. Um, I always like to essentially break down some of what these terms mean. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the history of least privilege, which I think is a really important concept to think about as we look at optimizing for DevSecOps, and talk a little bit about my last 10 years building basically cloud native application platforms and systems, and what we've learned and observed through that. So I'm going to go through a little bit of that at the start and get into then a little bit where we're going with our Tanzu roadmap and why I find that it's so exciting. So if you have questions, I'm not sure if there's a way of chatting them in, but feel free if you can to hop in. So enterprise security is sort of changing. I think we used to have the assumption that in order to be secure, you had to go slow. And I think this was what I basically spent the last 10 years working on changing. It was sort of the idea that high control, low change systems were more secure. And I think we've all seen that was a prima facie sort of improper assumption. We've all lived through sort of the Equifax hacks of the world where there might have been an overly deliberate security response process. So, hey, a patch has been discovered, a vulnerability has been discovered, let's schedule a meeting. And let's have a meeting about the meeting to fix the vulnerability. And then meanwhile, within the 90-day window, people were able to use that exploit to get in and then uncover even more things. Oftentimes, you would uncover the idea that you had credentials that were long-lived running in the system. So now you've got an exploit where you've entered the system and the credentials are found, and then those credentials are oftentimes somewhat permanent. So I believe in the Equifax case, the credentials have been there for many years for the core database. And then you have, essentially hostile actors living in systems which are then themselves long-lived. And so what happens is this idea of a slow-moving system is, more secure really comes crashing down. While there's the illusion of control, what you've actually exposed is you've prolonged, any of the vulnerabilities of the system to attack. And I think that one of the core assumptions that DevSecOps makes is that automation should use speed as a weapon against security threats. And I think rethinking some of these old concepts around least privileged design to incorporate modern ideas of ephemerality and frequent change are the most important topics in DevSecOps for me. So I like to go back to basically the foundational elements of least privileged system design and say, how did we get off track with that? And what can we do to bring that back? One of the things that has changed, though, is that, we've really all seen as a society that building these highly interactive, user-oriented, rapidly changing modern applications has a profound effect. I think in our everyday lives, we see the value of more of this user-oriented design. And I think one of the key things about this user-oriented design is that it's not static. So as behaviors and processes evolve, these applications need to respond to that user and to say, what do they need to do with their job today? Not how do we build one static process and software that everyone just uses despite the pain, despite our desire to integrate it into new types of data, into new types of applications. And so this modern application really has to respond in almost a daily or weekly cadence to that user to keep pace. So security culture was, I think, forced to change by these two mega forces. One is the idea that slow-moving systems are actually more insecure, which is just prima facie, I believe, and it's been exposed. And the second is this more user-oriented approach to application design as opposed to a static process. And suddenly least privilege is really back into, what you might call fashion. And terms like zero trust have become the du jour, kind of talking points. I would say DevSecOps and zero trust are big talking points. And of course, we're paying close attention to that, designing our systems in that way. But it's curious to me, how we actually ever got away from this. Like why, despite articulating the need for least privilege in 1974, we've now, like, where did it go? Like, how did we get off track from the core fundamental assumption in computer research in this journal in 1974, which is the privilege of any process and any system and any user should be the least amount of privilege necessary to complete the job. Now, if you think about that, that's really not how the internet was designed, though, because the internet was really designed in a different way. And there's a really brilliant quote from Stina Eversard, who is the founder of YubiKey, which brings a strong authentication approach to internet applications, where she said a very simple thing, which has always struck with me, which is like, actually, while we might have done least privilege design early on, we actually got away from that with the internet, because the internet was fundamentally www, HTTP, or here's my document, everyone in the world should see it. So it is the opposite of least privilege design. So we've been building these collaboration first, these user first systems with internet technologies, which are really designed to share the files with the world. And we've been bolting on security and identity and authentication on top of them. And I think that's some of the challenge of this DevSecOps revolution, which is we used to go slow to lock things down, but now we're really trying to use internet style designs for collaboration first applications, but do them with security. And I think that the nice thing is that the desire for least privilege, certainly in financial services and government organizations, and I would say any enterprise, that's never going to go away. So DevSecOps has this great opportunity to bring least privilege design back to applications, even though they're built with internet technologies. And I think about Jeff Bezos is the expert at consumer technologies, and he says consumers always want it faster and cheaper. And my experience is that enterprises and governments would always prefer lesser privilege and more secure. So that's the one thing you can bet on not going away. And that's greatly influenced my perspective as CTO at Tanzu of like how we should be designing our systems for keeping that least privilege model in mind. And we've learned a lot about least privilege designs over the last decade by building some of our first generation technologies. So we had a set of technologies that are now known as the Tanzu Application Service. And while they had a narrower focus than the whole, infrastructure as a service like abstraction of Kubernetes, they were just for modern applications. We built into that system a remarkable set of automation and controls to bring security out of the box, which I still think are market leading and which we're bringing forward. And I want to share a couple of those observations with you from the last decade now, and then we're going to continue to innovate and push that forward in the future. One of the biggest things that I would recommend to anyone building a cloud native system today is that there's a tremendous opportunity to improve the developer experience while at the same time building compliance and controls into it. So I think there are sort of two approaches I've seen. One is a very slow moving, controls are all that matters world where it's very hard to get anything done. Every process approval takes forever. It's not even DevSecOps, it's just traditional operations, if you will, because there's so much friction in the system. But what we did with our original CF push and our automated app deployment with Cloud Foundry and Taz is we essentially baked all of the automation for a secure build, a secure layer 7, strong container identity, strong privilege control over in terms of what other containers that container could access, what data services that container could access. Strong policy was just baked into the developer experience. And so at the same time that the developer had this beautiful paved path, where they could easily exercise all of the things they needed to do to get their job done and deploy their apps. All of those things had inherent security controls baked into them. So what I would see would be at large organizations that might have had a raw container strategy platform and as well as a developer experience with controls, is you would see maybe 2, 3, 4 orders of magnitude more consumption of that strong developer experience with controls. And I think that's one of the most important things we're doing with Tanzu. You even saw yesterday, Microsoft started bringing out these application services on top of their Kubernetes to start to bring this idea of you need an opinionated developer experience to really consume Kubernetes. So we're super excited about that. And I think we're a market leader in terms of that. And I'll talk a bit more about it. The next thing is that we believe these cloud native platforms, they need to rapidly repair any vulnerable software. And I would say we're going from a world of these imperative style CI/CD pipelines where, okay, I've got an application update. Now I want to push that to production. Where we're going in our future designs is that as an event occurs that exposes a vulnerability, that should kick off a controller reconciler pattern of rebuilding. And I would call that more of an event-centric pipeline versus like a classic imperative-centric, okay, it's time to deploy the app. Now we're going to do a fresh one. And so with our modern application services on Tanzu and our build service, as soon as a vulnerability is detected, we're going to auto build a fresh container with a secure version of that app. And I think the idea that any vulnerability should, when possible, be by default repaired as soon as possible could really help stop these Equifax-like exploits where, okay, there's a vulnerability, now let's have a meeting. And I think that's what we're trying to get away from in general with Tanzu, which is API-first design, secure by default designs, as opposed to ticket-driven and meeting-driven deployments and infrastructure. The other thing that we learned, and I think this really ties into least privilege, is that you could rebuild the system because of its declarative nature. And so with Taz and with Cloud Foundry, large organizations would often, I think Wells Fargo is quoted publicly as saying, every 2 or 3 days, we're going to completely repave and rebuild every virtual machine in the system. And this really reduces the amount of time an attacker has to orient themselves within your system, potentially exfiltrate data. Any of the things we're really worried about, the more ephemeral a system is, the harder it is to linger there. And so I would say that in modern cloud systems where we have this incredible degree of declarative automation, least privilege starts to become a time to live. And I'm really guiding us to start to think about the shorter an entity that's executing a task can live, the lesser its privilege, and therefore it's more inherently secure. So the idea that you can constantly repave these systems, constantly rebuild them from a declarative manifest is super important. And then finally, along with that, treating credentials is something that you repair and repave frequently, and focusing more on inherent strong identity versus shared credentials is a big move for us. So these are all things that are important in cloud native security and that are an important part of Tanzu. So I don't think anyone can ask me any questions, so I haven't seen any, so I'm going to continue to kind of roll through this. Are people that are, from the Tanzu side, are people able to hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good. How's it going so far? Can you hear me? Is everything making sense?
Amazing. No, this is perfect. Thank you, James. Okay. And we'll be feeding you some questions at the end from the attendees. You don't see them in your view, but we'll be getting them to you at the end.
Okay, awesome. I'm having fun speaking it, but I'm not used to just talking to myself in my condo for 30 minutes straight. So I appreciate hearing another human.
Of course. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Yeah. So these are a set of principles which, whether you're using Tanzu or not, I think can apply. Oh gosh, I forgot to edit out my all caps here at the bottom. That should be just regular. That was a note to self. So these are principles that I think you could apply to any system. Obviously, immutability is common knowledge today. Like, hey, the ability to just rebuild that system from an immutable image as opposed to trying to change it is a better way of making sure that you don't have configuration drift. The more immutable your system is, by some nature of that, you're going to get less configuration drift in most cases. But I think, as I was mentioning, it's not enough to just be immutable. Some organizations will say, like, okay, now that you've got this nice, deployment manifest, everything's governable, you can look at what's happening in the system just by looking at the deployment manifest. I don't believe that's true. I believe that if there is a threat that may have entered the system, that you need not only immutability, but you need ephemerality. And that you want to reduce the time to live of as many nodes in that system as possible. So it's one thing to say, like, here's my deployment manifest, I can govern it and provide security by looking at that manifest, but I also think your time to live is the right kind of action-oriented monitoring, right? Like, we tend to think like, oh, well, let's monitor these systems for, any security escalations, but that can get very noisy. So I think designing ephemerality into it from the start is critical. And thankfully, as I mentioned down in the bottom, there are technologies coming to Kubernetes like Knative, which bring more of a serverless mindset, which is that I can spin nodes up and down, scale them to 0 by default. And I think designing more and more of your modern applications for a Knative and Knative enhanced with DevX kind of experience is going to be critical going forward to security. That's a little bit different than saying, like, hey, let's just apply least privileges on Linux processes very low down in the system. I think starting to think about the privilege of an active, web node on the system and how long it's living is just as important. I think the other thing that we're, principles that we're working on is that we've hired the team behind Spiffy and Spire that really take a strong identity versus long-lived shared secrets approach to platform security. What we'd really like to see ideally is that you have inherent strong identity of every node in the system, so it doesn't have the shared secret to pass around. So in the same way that YubiKey provides strong identity for who you are on the internet, which is a game changer, having strong identity inherently baked into every node of the system so the platform knows the identity of itself and doesn't have to use a shared secret is critical. Then other actors can't access that shared secret and use it for essentially privilege escalation. Another principle is really event-driven vulnerability management. So I'm super inspired by what we're doing with some of our fresh approaches to that Cloud Foundry-like experience in Kubernetes, in that we are saying, as any vulnerability happens, automatically rebuild a container or automatically flag the system for a controller reconciler pattern of rebuilding. And I think asking ourselves, are we doing traditional imperative CI/CD or more of an event-driven CI/CD model is really important. And then, as I mentioned, developer experience and control and security, they really go together. So everything we're doing with our build service, as opposed to saying to every developer on the team, hey, go create your own Docker file, and as that vulnerability is found, kick a Jenkins script to rebuild it, saying, hey, you should really just give your Git version control, your version control system over to the build service, and that should automatically build a secure image for you. And we're really excited to see the ecosystem that's evolved around the build service, where players from Google, DigitalOcean, Microsoft have all joined in to really standardize on that open buildpacks.io model, which we think brings kind of that DevX and control together, as long as some new enhancements we're bringing to the platform. The final area that we're pushing, I'll get into a little bit more, which is that more and more applications are API first. And that gives us an opportunity to bring what we had in terms of API security by default to every application. One moment, let me switch back. So we're super excited about Knative, and I'll close here. We believe that it's not enough just to have a Kubernetes distribution in order to be, kind of active in this cloud native world. You really need a holistic approach that encompasses application services so that the developer has more security, more control out of the box, is able to get their job done. I mean, the job really is building these modern applications which are more user-oriented, more API first. And API first applications, by the way, are just as user oriented because that developer is a user and they're going to want to see different fields, different changes constantly over time as they're evolving how they're using that API. They're going to have feedback. So these user oriented applications, these API first applications have to respond quickly. And we believe that you really need a simpler interface to get that deployed to Kubernetes. So these application services, such as Taz today and where we're going in the future, are critical. You need a secure container build service, and buildpacks.io is the community that's winning there. Do not use containers for custom applications without using a build service, a secure build service when possible. Just don't do it. You need a holistic approach that automates that versus leaving it to the benevolence of your script environment. I think that is a mistake that people can make and puts a lot of the burden back on the platform and the DevSecOps team. I think that we can bring API services and classic API security to every application. We made an acquisition called Mesh7, which brings some of the traditional API security features that were only available in monolithic centralized gateway to any Envoy. And that means that we can now bring every microservice a full suite of API security services. So you can have these API first applications moving at speed as opposed to having going through monolithic high latency API security tools. We think that you need, Kubernetes policy and lifecycle management, including the operating system. So what we're doing with Tanzu Mission Control allows you to have high policy, high automation Kubernetes. As you use our cluster API, it's also going to auto update your OS. This isn't something to patch on its own. It's sort of an inherent part of the immutable Kubernetes infrastructure. So that's very much necessary for this DevSecOps approach. And finally, or not finally, but you need application networking and security. So what we're doing with Tanzu Service Mesh, end-to-end encryption, the ability to do multi-cloud load balancing, this is very much a necessary part of this DevSecOps world. I see teams that say like, okay, well, we're trying to do DevSecOps with Kubernetes, but we have a slow-moving F5 team over here, so they're not able to update their configs. Or we're having a hard time applying encryption to every microservice and every API. Out of the box, Tanzu Service Mesh is going to give you that global load balancing automation, that high availability, as well as that encryption and strong policy in terms of access and controls. Finally, in terms of how you apply security at the application level, strong standardization. And Tanzu has the Spring Boot environment, which is the most popular API and enterprise application framework in the world. Spring Security is really very popular. It allows you to integrate into all of the latest identity and authorization systems in a secure and highly patterned way. And so I think my message to you today, if I could just wrap it up, given that I'm getting close to time, is we're super excited about bringing back least privileged systems, but for modern applications. And we think thinking about least privilege holistically will help, all of these organizations understand their DevSecOps journey in the fullness of computing history. And that allowing that to be applied in an iterative DevSecOps CI/CD way requires this holistic approach. And that is why, somebody with the scope and scale of the Tanzu engineering team with 1,300 engineers, we think we have the heft to deliver this in the software for the market. So I'm really, grateful for our partnership across the federal space. I know that a lot of great federal systems have been using this kind of cloud native approach to least privilege that we've been working on for the last decade successfully, and we're super excited about where we're going from here together.
Thanks, James. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Regarding your comment earlier on where you talked about organizations that have a structured compliance built in while helping developers deliver versus those that have an unstructured container strategy. The ones that are structured have a 3x adoption rate, I think, something like that you said. I'm curious what you think about the other side where an organization has made investments on an unstructured path. How often do you see them evolve, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that applying structure and automation as opposed to scripting is my key message from this. There is the idea that you can do anything with, let's just pick on Jenkins. Like if you want to do DevSecOps, theoretically, you could just have Jenkins and EC2 and you could burden Jenkins with doing everything. Like, hey, Jenkins do this, Jenkins do that, and you're scripting your way to automation. And therefore, anytime you want to make a change, you have to really understand this highly complex script that you built. You have to understand everything about that custom script. And you don't get a lot of out-of-the-box leverage. And so we see organizations that take the more scripting or what you might call verbose CI/CD approaches, having much slower deployments, much less developer experience, and lower adoption. See it all the time. The alternative to that is that whenever possible, use the highest abstraction you can. And that means using a build service versus a script. That means using a CF push-like interface versus constructing a full Kubernetes manifest. That means having programmatic access to something like a service mesh and a Tanzu service mesh with Avi, as opposed to kicking a Jenkins job off to go configure an F5 I rule. Those are examples, Mark, of where convenience wins. And because those are pre-built, the security group can approve those pre-built golden paths. And so you're really getting this 1 and 1 equals 5. And you're getting better developer experience, easier maintainability, and higher security. We're not doing our jobs if we're not taking free lunch like that.
I appreciate that. Craig McCluskey said similar yesterday. Thank you very much, James. We greatly appreciate it.